The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, also referred to as the Northern Ireland Secretary, is the principal Secretary of State in Her Majesty's government who represents Northern Ireland in Cabinet. The Secretary of State is a Minister of the Crown who is accountable to the Parliament of the United Kingdom and is the Chief Minister in the Northern Ireland office. As with other ministers, the position is appointed by the British monarch on the advice of the Prime Minister. The position is normally described simply as the Secretary of State by residents of Northern Ireland. Formerly holding a large portfolio over home affairs in Northern Ireland, the current devolution settlement has lessened the Secretary of State's role, granting many of the former powers to the Northern Ireland Assembly and Northern Ireland Executive. The Secretary of State is now generally limited to representing Northern Ireland in the UK Cabinet, overseeing the operation of the devolved administration and a number of reserved and accepted matters which remain the sole competence of the UK government, e.g. security, human rights, certain public inquiries and the administration of elections. Created in 1972, the position has switched between members of Parliament from the Conservative Party and Labour Party. As Labour has not fielded candidates in Northern Ireland and the Conservatives have not had candidates elected to Northern Ireland Assembly or for House of Commons seats in the region, those appointed as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland have not represented a constituency in Northern Ireland. This contrasts with the Secretary of State for Scotland and the Secretary of State for Wales. The Secretary of State officially resides in Hillsborough Castle, which was previously the official residence of the Governor of Northern Ireland, and remains the royal residence of the monarch in Northern Ireland. The Secretary of State exercises their duties through, and is administratively supported by, the Northern Ireland Office, NIO. Historically, the principal ministers for Irish, and subsequently Northern Ireland, affairs in the UK government and its predecessors were the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, c. 1171-1922, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, 1560-1922, and the Home Secretary, 1922-1972. In August 1969, for example, Home Secretary James Callaghan approved the sending of British Army soldiers to Northern Ireland. Scotland and Wales were represented by the Secretary of State for Scotland and Secretary of State for Wales from 1885 and 1964 respectively, but Northern Ireland remained separate, owing to the devolved Northern Ireland Government and Northern Ireland Parliament. The office of Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was created after the Northern Ireland Government, at Stormont, was first suspended and then abolished following widespread civil strife. The British government was increasingly concerned that Stormont was losing control of the situation. On March 30, 1972, direct rule from Westminster was introduced. The Secretary of State filled three roles which existed under the previous Stormont regime. The Governor of Northern Ireland, the nominal head of the executive and representative of the British monarch. The Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, now filled by the First Minister of Northern Ireland and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland acting jointly. The Minister of Home Affairs, now filled by the Minister of Justice. Direct rule was seen as a temporary measure, with a power-sharing devolution preferred as the solution, and was annually renewed by a vote in Parliament. The Sunningdale Agreement in 1973 resulted in the brief existence of a power-sharing Northern Ireland executive from January 1, 1974, which was ended by the Loyalist Ulster Workers' Council strike on May 28, 1974. The strikers opposed the power-sharing in all Ireland aspects of the new administration. The Northern Ireland Constitutional Convention, 1975-1976, and Northern Ireland Assembly, 1982-1986, were unsuccessful in restoring devolved government. After the Anglo-Irish Agreement on November 15, 1985, the UK government and Irish government cooperated more closely on security and political matters. Following the Belfast Agreement, also known as the Good Friday Agreement, on April 10, 1998, devolution returned to Northern Ireland on December 2, 1999. This removed many of the duties of the Secretary of State and his Northern Ireland office colleagues and devolved them to locally elected politicians, constituting the Northern Ireland Executive. The devolved administration was suspended several times, especially between October 15, 2002 and May 8, 2007, because the Ulster Unionist Party and Democratic Unionist Party were uncomfortable being in government with Sinn Féin when the Provisional Irish Republican Army had failed to decommission its arms fully and continued its criminal activities. On each of these occasions, the responsibilities of the ministers in the executive then returned to the Secretary of State and his ministers. During these periods, In addition to administration of the region, the Secretary of State was also heavily involved in the negotiations with all parties to restore devolved government. Power was again devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly on May 8, 2007. The Secretary of State retained responsibility for policing and justice until most of those powers were devolved on April 12, 2010. Robert Hazel has suggested merging the offices of Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales into one Secretary of State for the Union, in a department into which Rodney Brazier has suggested adding a Minister of State for England with responsibility for English local government. Colour key Conservative. Labour. Asterisk incumbents length of term last updated, December 21, 2020.